Singapore should not look like this. A tiny island at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula has become a landscape of futuristic towers, immaculate streets, spectacular gardens, and one of Asia's most important business centers. Yet its greatest achievement may not be what Singapore built, but how quickly it transformed itself. The story did not begin from nothing. Singapore had been an important trading port long before independence, positioned beside one of the world's great maritime routes and connected to commerce, moving between Asia and the wider world. But when Singapore became independent in 1965, its future was far from guaranteed. The new country was small, unemployment was a serious challenge, housing conditions were difficult for many families, and there were few natural resources to build an economy around. What Singapore did possess was location. Ships traveling between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific passed through one of the world's most strategically valuable regions, giving the island an advantage that its leaders were determined to turn into something much larger. Instead of trying to protect a small domestic economy, Singapore looked outward. It pursued international trade, welcomed multinational companies, and positioned itself as a place where global businesses could manufacture, invest, and connect with rapidly growing Asian markets. Industrialization became one of the first great engines of transformation. New factories and industrial areas created employment, while Singapore actively courted foreign companies that could bring investment, technology, and access to international markets. Jurong became a symbol of that ambition. What had once seemed an unlikely location for industry developed into a major manufacturing center, demonstrating the willingness to invest heavily before success was guaranteed. Foreign investment brought more than money. International manufacturers created jobs, introduced new skills, and connected Singapore to supply chains extending far beyond the island, helping the economy move progressively toward more sophisticated industries. But factories alone could never create the Singapore visible today. The country needed something more difficult to build: confidence that companies, investors, and ordinary citizens could plan for the future. Governance became central to that strategy. Singapore developed institutions known for administrative efficiency, relatively low corruption, and long-term planning, creating an environment in which international businesses could operate with greater predictability. Infrastructure followed the same philosophy. Roads, utilities, industrial estates, and telecommunications were treated not simply as public services, but as foundations upon which the wider economy could grow. And nowhere is that logic more visible than the port. Singapore turned its position beside major shipping routes into one of its greatest economic advantages. Containers, fuel, manufactured goods, and raw materials could move efficiently through an island that increasingly functioned as a connection point for global commerce. The same thinking eventually extended into the skies. Singapore developed aviation infrastructure capable of connecting a tiny domestic market with destinations around the world, turning geographic limitation into another form of international connectivity. Yet the transformation happening inside Singapore was just as important. In the early years, adequate housing was a national emergency. Large numbers of people needed better homes, and the government responded with an enormous program of public housing construction through the Housing and Development Board. Entire new towns began replacing overcrowded and inadequate living conditions. Apartments were accompanied by transport, schools, shops, and public spaces, creating neighborhoods designed around everyday life rather than housing alone. Then Singapore pushed the idea further. Public housing increasingly became a pathway toward home ownership, allowing many households to build a permanent stake in the country's rapidly changing future. Education formed another part of the same system. A country without large reserves of minerals, farmland, or energy resources would have to depend heavily on the capabilities of its people. Schools, technical training, and universities became closely connected to economic development. As Singapore moved from basic manufacturing toward electronics, engineering, finance, and advanced industries, its workforce had to move with it. This created a cycle that became increasingly powerful. Better infrastructure attracted investment. Investment created employment. Education supported more sophisticated industries. And rising economic activity provided resources for another generation of development. The physical transformation became impossible to miss. Where older waterfront districts once handled traditional commerce, a modern financial skyline began rising around Marina Bay. Reclaimed land expanded the city, while transport networks connected increasingly dense neighborhoods across the island. Singapore was learning how to turn scarcity into pressure for efficiency. Limited land encouraged vertical development, careful planning, and constant decisions about what deserved space on an island where almost every kilometer mattered. Even water scarcity became part of that mentality. Reservoirs, water recycling, desalination, and long-term infrastructure planning reduced vulnerability, while turning resource management into another field of technological expertise. By the time the world began viewing Singapore as a wealthy financial center, the foundations had already been built across decades. The spectacular skyline was not the beginning of the success story. It was one of its most visible consequences. Today, Singapore combines advanced manufacturing, international finance, technology, trade, and globally connected services within an economy whose income per person ranks among the highest in the region. But perhaps the most important part of Singapore's transformation is that no single secret explains it. Geography mattered, but geography had always been there. The difference was how aggressively the country built systems around that advantage. Trade, foreign investment, housing, education, infrastructure, and long-term planning reinforced one another until a vulnerable young nation became one of the most competitive economies in the world. And yet, becoming wealthy created an entirely new set of questions. Because behind the futuristic skyline lies another Singapore, one confronting extraordinarily expensive land, an aging population, dependence on global trade, and the challenge of ensuring that the rewards of success remain widely shared. Singapore solved many of the problems that once threatened its future. What happened next would determine whether one of the world's most remarkable economic transformations could continue. The Singapore that emerged from this transformation is now one of the most globally connected places on Earth. Its skyline may dominate the postcards, but beneath those towers lies an economic system built around remaining useful to a world far larger than Singapore itself. Finance became one of the clearest examples. Banks, investment firms, insurers, and multinational companies established major operations here, turning the central business district into one of Asia's most important financial centers. But Singapore never abandoned the physical economy that helped build its success. Manufacturing remains important, especially in sophisticated industries where technology, precision, and highly trained workers matter more than access to cheap land or abundant natural resources. Semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, aerospace, and advanced engineering became part of a broader evolution. Singapore was no longer competing simply by making products efficiently, but by positioning itself inside some of the world's most valuable industries. The port evolved in much the same way. Enormous container terminals connect shipping routes across Asia and beyond, reinforcing Singapore's role as a place where global trade can move efficiently between markets. Changi Airport provides another gateway to the world. What could have been simply an airport serving a small country became an international aviation hub, connecting Singapore with cities across Asia, Europe, Australia, the Middle East, and beyond. Its success also reveals something fundamental about Singapore's strategy. Infrastructure here is often designed not only to solve today's problems, but to make the country more attractive for the opportunities it hopes will arrive tomorrow. That philosophy is visible across the city. The MRT carries millions of journeys through dense urban neighborhoods, while expressways, pedestrian networks, and carefully planned commercial centers allow a large population to function within an extraordinarily limited amount of land. Public housing remains one of the most distinctive parts of the Singapore model. Large residential communities stretch far beyond the famous skyline, providing a very different picture of the country from Marina Bay and its luxury towers. These neighborhoods are not simply collections of apartment blocks. Transport, schools, food centers, parks, and everyday services are woven into many communities, reflecting decades of planning around the realities of dense urban life. Then there is the Singapore that visitors encounter through food. Hawker centers bring together Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other culinary traditions within communal spaces that remain central to daily life. In one meal, Singapore's history as a meeting point between cultures becomes immediately visible. The same diversity appears across neighborhoods such as Chinatown, Little India, and Kampong Glam. Modern towers may dominate the skyline, but older streets, places of worship, and historic districts reveal layers of identity beneath the city's polished surface. Singapore has also worked aggressively to soften the environmental cost of density. Trees line major roads, parks connect neighborhoods, and vegetation increasingly climbs across buildings and rooftops. The ambition is not to recreate untouched nature, but to make greenery part of an intensely urban environment. Gardens by the Bay turns that ambition into spectacle. Futuristic structures rise above carefully designed gardens beside Marina Bay, creating an image of Singapore that combines technology, nature, and urban planning in a single landscape. Yet the success visible around Marina Bay comes with a price. Singapore regularly ranks among the world's most expensive cities. Limited land, strong demand, and high incomes can make housing, vehicles, and many aspects of daily life extraordinarily costly compared with neighboring countries. For visitors, that can be surprising. Travel through much of Southeast Asia is associated with relatively low daily costs, but Singapore operates within a very different economic reality. The pressure extends beyond tourism. As the economy became wealthier, expectations rose with it, and questions about affordability, inequality, and the cost of maintaining a comfortable life became increasingly important. Demographics create another challenge. Singapore's population is aging, while low birth rates mean the country must think carefully about its future workforce and the balance between local population growth and immigration. Foreign workers and international talent remain deeply connected to the economy. They contribute across industries ranging from construction and domestic services to finance, research, and technology, making migration an important but sometimes sensitive part of Singapore's future. Global dependence brings another vulnerability. Singapore's prosperity relies heavily on international trade, investment, and stability. When shipping slows, global demand weakens or tensions disrupt major trade routes. A highly connected economy can feel those changes quickly. Competition is growing as well. Cities across Asia are investing in airports, financial services, technology, logistics, and infrastructure, meaning Singapore must continue improving simply to protect advantages built over decades. And that may explain why the country often seems permanently unfinished. New transport lines appear, districts are redeveloped, land is reclaimed, and infrastructure projects look decades into the future. Singapore behaves less like a country that believes it has succeeded than one that assumes standing still would be dangerous. That mentality extends to the next generation of industries. Technology, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, clean energy, and advanced manufacturing are increasingly important as Singapore searches for growth that requires knowledge rather than vast amounts of land. But can other countries simply copy the Singapore model? Not easily. Singapore is a compact city-state positioned beside one of the world's most important shipping corridors. Its geography, political system, population size, and historical circumstances make direct comparisons with much larger countries difficult. What can be studied is the underlying philosophy. Singapore repeatedly invested in capabilities before they became urgent. Education before advanced industries arrived, infrastructure before demand fully existed, and global connectivity before the domestic economy could ever justify it alone. It also treated limitations as permanent realities rather than temporary inconveniences. Little land encouraged density. Few natural resources encouraged investment in people. A small domestic market encouraged international trade. That does not mean every policy was perfect, or that Singapore's development came without difficult trade-offs. Economic success can coexist with social pressures, and extraordinary national wealth does not mean every household experiences prosperity in the same way. But the transformation remains remarkable. Within the lifetime of people still living today, Singapore moved from a vulnerable, newly independent state into a global center of trade, finance, manufacturing, aviation, and technology. The glittering towers around Marina Bay are the most obvious symbol of that journey. The deeper achievement lies beneath them: institutions, infrastructure, education, and decades of decisions designed around survival in a world where Singapore could never afford to become irrelevant. Singapore did not become wealthy because it discovered oil beneath its streets or gold beneath its harbor. It became wealthy by turning location into connectivity, people into human capital, scarcity into efficiency, and long-term planning into economic advantage. And perhaps that is Singapore's real secret. The country never had the luxury of assuming success would come naturally. So it built an economy around making itself valuable to the rest of the world, and then kept rebuilding it before the world had the chance to move on.